Hi everyone, my name is Tony and I work at Wilfrid Laurier University. Today I'm here to teach you a little bit about my favorite river, the Grand River. So the Grand River is 280 kilometers long. It begins its track through southern Ontario way up north in Dundalk. If you don't know where Dundalk is, it's actually closer to both Georgian Bay and to Lake Huron than it is to us way down here. As the river winds its way from the headwaters way up in Dundalk, it travels through places like Elora, Fergus, Waterloo, Kitchener, Cambridge, Brantford, all the way down to Port Maitland, at which point it flows out into Lake Erie. The Grand River is highly variable in its conditions depending on what time of year you're out here and the weather that's currently affecting it. So we had a bunch of rain in the last few weeks, so the water level's quite high. Along the weed edge here you can see other plants have been squished flat and pushed down by the overflowing waters. And in the springtime the water level is significantly higher than it is right now. If you're a fisherman, you already know about the Grand River. It's home to a number of desirable fish species such as brown trout, brook trout, rainbow trout, as well as bass, smallmouth bass, pike, largemouth bass, depending on where you're fishing as you head down to its endpoint, Lake Erie. If you're fishing down at the far end, you can even catch things like salmon. Now, the reason that this is such a productive watershed for making big fish and fish for catching is that there are a great deal of benthic invertebrates along the bottom. And what invertebrates are animals without backbones. So we're talking about all the little bugs and critters like that that live at the bottom of the river. If you're a fisherman or a fish, they're important for you because they're the food that the fish eat. Here's a pretty typical rock from the bottom of the river. If you look closely, hopefully you see a lot of things moving around, a lot of life living on and amongst the rock. Now, to me as a scientist, I use those benthic invertebrates for a little bit different reason. By collecting them and looking at which individuals are down there, we can learn a little bit more about the ecosystem. We can learn about how it's functioning, and we can learn a little bit more about its health. Number of nice caddisfly cases there along the bottom. Now, the Grand River is fed by a number of different rivers and streams throughout its course, including the Conestoga River, the Speed River, the Nith River, the Eramosa River, as well as several others. Here's an example of a creek that's flowing into the river. And in this creek habitat, you'll notice there's heavy tree cover, and there's not going to be a lot of light that's able to penetrate down to the bottom. So in this habitat, we're going to see a lot more of the leaves and twigs being the base of the food chain here that these insects are going to be feeding on. As we look down the river, way down that way, we can see a lot of tree cover along the sides. Now, those trees are going to provide an abundant food source to the bottom of the river. Every time it storms and every time it rains, and then every fall, those trees are going to lose their leaves, branches might get broken off, things are going to decay and die, and those will end up in the watershed, in the river. Now, there's a number of animals down at the bottom of the river that play a role in breaking that stuff down. Those would be called the shredders. Now, the shredders basically feed on anything that's huge, all the organic matter that's large, 1 millimeter or bigger in this world. So those big guys, they're munching on things and ripping them up into smaller pieces. Some good examples include things like caddis flies and amphipods or scuds. There's other animals that live down there as well. In spots of the river where there's not tree cover, the rocks on the bottom, there's an opportunity for plants and algae to grow. Now, the algae that grows there doesn't typically grow as just a big sheet. It's more often found in a complex community of different bacteria and protozoans and fungi as well. Animals that feed on that periphyton or that biological biofilm are called grazers or scrapers. They'll use their mouth parts to go along and graze on top of that, or a scraping type mouth part to feed off the surface of that. Snails are a good example of a scraper, and many mayflies can be acting as grazers. The last group that we can talk about as far as those main feeders are the collectors. Now, there's two main types of collectors. There's those that wander around and collect the small bits that those shredders have made, as well as those that are going to be filter feeding small bits. So the filter feeders may include things like black flies and a number of caddisflies. Collectors can be represented by a number of different species as well. Many of them have legs and will be moving amongst the rocks collecting these small bits, but oftentimes there'll be flies or something like a chironomid, like this guy. And he basically lives in a burrow and runs out and collects small pieces of things. Then he eats them and accumulates the debris into, well, poop, which can then be broken down by other things. The last group of invertebrates that I really want to talk about today would be the predators. So even in this ecosystem, there's going to be tiny little animals that are going to be preying on anything smaller than it. And those include many of the things like dragonflies, damselflies, as well as many of the aquatic true bugs. Those are ones with stabbing or piercing mouth parts. Now the portion of the river that I'm at here has very little tree cover along that side. Actually along this side as well. And in these environments we're going to have that cobblestone bottom with that biofilm layer. And this biofilm layer, it's kind of a sticky, gooey mess. So like, we've got algae there, and they're secreting things like sugars and bacteria, and things are feeding on that, and it kind of becomes this kind of gooey mess. If you've been up in the cottage country before and you've slept on or you stepped on like a slippery rock or kind of like a gooey deck, that's that biofilm layer that I'm talking about. And in these habitats, those small bits of organic matter can get hung up in those, and it makes a good spot for those collectors to kind of hang out and collect those little bits that get stuck in there. Depending on the sampling location within this river, we're going to find totally different things. So if I go to a calm pool along the side where there's not a lot of flow, I'm going to find different individuals than I will in deep pools and fast riffles where the water's flowing quickly over the surface of some rocks. You're going to find individuals that are adapted to high and low flow areas, turbulent waters and calm waters. You're going to find individuals adapted to living on vegetation, those living in rocks, those living amongst the rocks, those living underneath the soil and in the sediment, as well as a number of other locations. So there's also lots of vegetation like this. All kinds of weedy vegetation that gets caught and snagged and hung up on the rocks on the bottom. And then this can provide a food source for many other animals as well. So we've got weedy vegetation that roots in the bottom, as well as those that just got caught on snags. Here's a representative of the larger invertebrates that we have in the Grand River. There's a little crayfish right there. crayfish is a crustacean, different from an insect. Very obvious way to tell is the number of antennae. He's got 2 pairs. I'll be collecting specimens today with this. This is called a dip net or a D net. The way I use this is I set it on the bottom of the river with the direction of flow. So I've got the river running along beside me this way, past the camera. So I'm going to set the net down on the bottom and then disturb the bottom, kicking some of the rocks and stones. And then all the small insects and invertebrates that are on them will be dislodged and wash into this net. Once I've accumulated a few of the net, I'll bring them back in the bucket and we'll go look at them. Now, when a researcher is out doing his collection, they follow a standardized method where they're kicking along a set path for a set amount of time and then collecting a specific amount of insects. And we standardize this across all the different people that are doing the research. And the reason that we do this is we keep things consistent and we can compare them to one another. So what I'm doing here today is not proper scientific method. It's just going out and getting a good kick net on the bottom, collecting a bunch of these animals, and then we're going to bring them back to the lab. So everything that I just kick netted has congregated at the bottom of this net. I'm going to do a quick swoop, and then any fish that I found, I'll put back into the river. All right, next I'm going to go along the weed edge here. And rather than kicking so I don't stir up too much mud, I'm going to kick a little bit and sweep through the weeds a whole bunch and try and pick off the insects that are living in and amongst the weeds. Alright, so here we are a couple minutes later. Here's our sample that we've taken from out in the riffle. And the riffle is where we had the cobble bottom and the water was flowing a little bit quicker. Light is able to reach the bottom, and because light's able to reach the bottom, we have lots of algae that's able to grow. There's also small fish in here, like this darter. And these small fish feed on some of the smaller invertebrates. So when we think of an aquatic food chain, oftentimes we think of the fish as being at the top of the food chain, but many of these small invertebrates are actually quite large and are able to feed on some of the smallest of the fish. Our other sample looks quite a bit different. You'll notice in the bottom, rather than being little bits of gravel, there's little bits of plant matter in what we call organic matter. So stuff that originated on land and found its way into the water makes up the bulk of the food in this sample. Whereas this sample is a little bit different. Most of this food that these guys are eating is food that originated in the river. It's stuff where the sun has come down and allowed a layer of biofilm and algae, we call that periphyton, and that grows on top of the rocks, and these guys feed on it. So I'm going to go through and collect any and all the fish that I find and let them go back in the river, and then we'll bring some of these insects back to the lab. So next time you'll see me, we'll be back in the lab. I think it's important to stress that Anytime we're down at the river, it is just a snapshot at any one point in time. These animals that we're encountering have life cycles. At any point in time, one species may be an egg, while another is approaching adulthood. And depending on which time of year it is, different food sources will be available in abundance or plenty. Obviously, the stuff that's available in the winter will not be available in the heat of the summer. When there's ice on top of the river, there's not a lot of light getting through. So we're going to see just a snapshot of what the Grand River looked like at this point in the fall. All right, welcome back to the lab, everybody. So as I got back to the lab, I started sorting through all the samples and putting things into little containers to get a good look at them. And now I'm going to walk through some of these things, and we'll kind of take a look at which members are present here in the Grand River and who is there doing each of these roles. Okay, so if we start with leaf litter as the base of the food chain, we're going to find the shredders of the Grand River. Our shredders include guys like this, a caddisfly. This guy here will use his mandibles and mouth parts to rip up those small pieces of organic matter. Other caddisflies can serve as collectors, gatherers, or even scrapers, depending on which habitat they're found. They're a diverse group of animals who have filled a number of ecological niches in aquatic environments. All of the caddisflies have one thing in common, and that is that they're able to use silk, similar to butterflies and moths. The way that they use silk is a little bit different. They don't necessarily build a cocoon, but they use their silk to attach pieces of debris or rocks and things that they find in their aquatic environment and build themselves like a mini suit of armor or a case inside which they can hide. It provides them with ballast, buoyancy, as well as protection. You can see their gills here, as well as some claws at the back of their body that help them climb along the surface. In my samples, I found at least 3 or 4 different types of caddisflies. These ones here use leaves to build a case, but many of them will use their silk to make a web to catch fine particulate matter that's flowing downstream, which would classify them as a filter collector. And many others include this guy here, who kind of lives in a rock burrow and will climb out and collect pieces of the debris on the bottom. So these would also be kind of a collector as well, a collector-gatherer. I came across a number of these and these as well. These are chironomids, and these are oligochaetes. Oligochaetes are like earthworms. These are just basically a small freshwater version of an earthworm. Closely related, but not the same. These guys would belong to the collector group as well. Generally, they live in burrows and kind of move along the bottom of the river and collect little bits of organic matter that they come across. We also came across a number of mollusks in our samples. 2 main groups of mollusks are present in the Grand River. We have these ones, which are bivalves. Bivalves include things like clams and mussels, which are quite abundant in the Grand River. And these guys are filter feeders that are basically taking fine particulate matter out of the water system and running it through their gills and feeding on it. We also have a number of these, and these are snails, hopefully very familiar to all of you. Snails move along and belong to the scraper group. They have a specialized mouth part called a radula that they move along and scrape the surface of the rocks or plants or basically anything and scrape away that top layer of organic matter. Some of them are quite durable and are actually able to digest and feed directly on some of those big macrophytes. Those are the largest of the aquatic plants. These are mayflies. Mayflies are also a type of insect. Similar to the caddisflies, they're a larval form, so they will not have wings and they are not able to fly until they are fully adults. I found 3 main types of mayflies in the Grand River samples today. I had these guys here, which is kind of a flat-headed mayfly. These guys here are very flat. They're designed to live in the highest flow areas of the river, and they'll roam around on the rocks, scraping on the periphyton. I also found these guys here. This is a minnow mayfly. They're much more adept at swimming and are able to cling to aquatic vegetation due to the shape of their legs. Both of these species have gills along the side of their body, and you can see them moving to increase the water flow across the gills. These are both species that need to live in oxygen-rich environments. The next one we're going to look at here is a burrowing mayfly. This guy here is a little bit different. He's also a mayfly. He's got the similar structures to the other guys, gills along the abdomen there. But this guy here lives down inside a burrow underneath and between the rocks. Their burrow is U-shaped, and he undulates his body up and down, driving a water current through. As such, he's kind of a filter-collector combo. I would say he's a collector-gatherer type. So he's congregating little bits of debris that get sucked into his tunnel, and he will eat them then from there. Next up, I need to talk about the predators. So there are three main types of predators that I found in the samples. We had these tiny guys here, little dragonflies. We had these guys right here, a couple different types of damselflies. And we also had these right here. And this one here is a cealid, which is basically an alderfly. All three of these are engulfer type predators, so they will be using their mouth parts to basically chew up and eat anything small enough to fit inside their mouths. One more group to talk about are the piercers. Now, the piercers are the bugs. There's two types of piercers. There's those that pierce into aquatic vegetation and suck out plant juices. In our samples today, the most abundant bug were backswimmers, like this guy here. The backswimmers we found today were all adults swimming around in the water. As such, they don't have gills. They actually have to figure out a different way to get their oxygen when they're below the water. The way they go about doing this is by bringing oxygen from above the water down underneath the water with them. All adult insects that are basically living above the water or flying between bodies of water will need to have some means of bringing water or air with them underneath the water. Whether that's minute hairs or structures underneath their wings, many different species have figured out different techniques. So these aquatic bugs have a piercing, stabbing mouth part, and their front legs are adapted to grab onto things. Basically, this guy swims through the water column, grabs onto anything that's small enough that it feels it can take it on, stabs into it with a piercing mouth part, injects in some digestive enzymes and some venom. And the last individual that I'd like to talk about today are the crayfish. So there's three different species of crayfish right here in this spot of the Grand River. Depending on the species, they're adapted to live in different spots of the river. Some of them will live under the larger boulders in the higher flow areas, whereas some of them may be found closer to the weed edge. Crayfish are omnivores, and as such, they don't quite fit into any one of those functional feeding groups that we've talked about. Depending on the time of day, they could be shredding up bits of plant and organic matter. If something wandered too close and they pinched it with their chile or their pinchers, they could be a predator at that point in time, acting as an engulfer, chewing up and eating whatever it is that they caught. But they can also serve a role as a gatherer, basically roaming along the bottom of the Grand River and collecting up small bits of organic matter and filtering them into their mouths. You can see their mouth parts really working here, filtering out small bits of food. All right, I think that wraps up my time for you today. I hope that it wasn't too long in the tooth and you didn't get too bored with what was happening here today, and that some of you found a little bit of this stuff interesting. But I do hope that all of you have a little bit more of an understanding of what's happening down at the bottom of the food chain now. And especially here in our most important river in the region, the Grand River.